Welcome to the final episode of season 2 of Teaching Peace. Over the last couple of months, we've had some robust and inspirational conversations with leaders in the peace movement from around the world. This series of conversations is developed in partnership with New York City Council of Mennonite Churches, Education Committee, Groundswell Group, and the Brooklyn Peace Center.
We begin each episode by acknowledging the land upon which these organizations sit. We recognize that we are located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape people. We acknowledge the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement is part of our ongoing work to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. On Teaching Peace, we engage in conversation with people doing the work of peace building. My name is Jason Storbakken. I serve as pastor at Manhattan Mennonite Fellowship and as co-director of the Brooklyn Peace Center.
And my name is Addie Banks, former pastor and currently executive director of the Groundswell Group and chair of the Education Committee of the New York City Council of Mennonite Churches.
In this episode of Teaching Peace, we are in conversation with Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. Dr. Brock is Senior Vice President and Director of the Shay Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America. She leads the organization's efforts to deepen understanding about moral injury in the many populations who experience it. A noted theologian, Dr. Brock was the founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School, where she also was a research professor of theology and culture. Among other books, she is co-author of Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, and Proverbs of Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and the Search for What Saves Us. She is a leading national expert on moral injury in combat veterans and has offered trainings for VA mental health providers, for professional chaplains, and for veterans and their families. Rita, welcome to Teaching Peace.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Rita, we always begin with this question. How do you define peace?
It's always a great question. I think my mind changes on it all the time. I believe that peace is the creative use of conflict. I don't think of peace as the absence of conflict. I think that people tend to think of peace and harmony and that sort of absence of conflict as a state of peace. But I think that without conflict, or at least without disagreement, there isn't any change.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that change is always happening. So to try to hold on to an absence of conflict is actually impossible. A conflict can be quite creative, and so I think the struggle with peace is when you have conflict, how do you use it? How does in a way that's creative and enables people to thrive, rather than trying to stop conflict?
Yeah, so good. And even when you look at movies and books, storytelling, conflict is what drives the narrative forward towards its resolution.
Exactly. And I have inner conflicts that I have to sort out and think through myself. And that's also an important process. So I think it's the state of peace is possible, but it's temporary, that sense of inner calm and equilibrium. Because if you're following the flow of things and the ambiguities of life, you're just going to hit, you're going to hit conflicts, you may even experience forms of violence. And the process is how do we come to terms with that in a creative way that helps people thrive rather than fall apart?
Yeah. You've been an activist for most of your life and a voice for social conscience for decades. Can you tell us about your early life and what led you to become a lifelong activist for social change and healing?
The first 6 years of my life, I was raised in a Japanese Buddhist family. And I'm not sure of this. I'm going to have to try to find this out from my family in Japan when I go visit sometime, because my mother's not with me to ask about my Japanese mother, about my grandfather being a Buddhist priest. Because of the family record I have is at some point in his young adulthood, he changed his first name to the name Jose at Hosei, which means enlightened one. And my aunt said he'd been a preacher at the local Buddhist temple. So I may have been raised partly by grandparents who were pretty devout Buddhists, not cultural Buddhists in the way most Japanese people are, but actually pretty serious Buddhists. I just remember them as quite loving and kind. And then I was brought to Fort Riley, Kansas by my military stepfather. My mother and I were brought to the United States. And so I grew up in the US military and experienced a fair amount of racism for being Japanese after World War II, when dirty Jap was kind of thrown around easily. And I didn't understand any of that until my first semester in college, when a civil rights movement sort of broke out, when Black students were threatened on campus with assassination. And as I began to be involved with that, I began to understand the history of racism in the United States. And it gave me a language for understanding what had happened to me, and also a way to do something to make positive change in response to what I had experienced and what other people were experiencing. And so I got hooked on activism, partly out of my own experience of racism, but also in solidarity with so many good people who were trying to make a difference in the world. I could see how important that was. So that's how I became an activist. And I just kept adding issues as I began to learn about them. So I started out with racism, and then and this was in Southern California, where the Asian American movement was also starting up at the same time. So I got involved in those in college. And then at the end of college, a feminist movement took hold, and I was part of that as I went off to seminary. And then LGBTQI issues came up. And so it's sort of the layers at which people have suffered have really helped me understand how much trauma there really is in the world.
Rita, you're widely known for your work in moral injury, which is, if I understand correctly, a dimension of trauma that refers to the shame or turmoil one feels for the morally compromised part one might have played in an episode of extreme violence in wartime or other distressed social conditions. Can you say something about how this is surfaced when someone has done this? What kinds of circumstances have you found yourself working in around this?
Well, the first group I was working with was military veterans. And I stumbled into moral injury almost by accident, because I was an anti-war activist. That was also there in college because of Vietnam, the racism and the violence of Vietnam. And so when the Iraq War and Afghanistan started, it just was horrible. It was just horrible what was happening. And so Gabrielle Latini, a colleague at Starr King School, and I thought that we needed a national conversation about what was going on. And the peace protests, I was in an September 2005 big thing at Washington, D.C., that they weren't having any impact. And here we were in 2008, 2009, and the wars were grinding on. And so we thought, well, let's have we both had some experience with truth commissions. So we said, let's have a truth commission on conscience and war. So we organized Truth Commission at Riverside Church with 100 different commissioners and 14 testifiers about the impact of war on military veterans. And so we had veterans testifying about, and some of whom had refused to redeploy after they saw what was going on in Iraq, and some of them who became conscientious objectors, and some who did not. So it was a sort of, we wanted different points of view. And then after the 4-hour hearing in Riverside Church, the next day, the 100 commissioners and 14 testifiers met to create a commission report with recommendations. And just before we had the Truth Commission, one of our commissioners got a hold of a pre-publication essay on moral injury, the one that was the first one written in 2009 in a clinical journal. And we read, Gabrielle and I read it and said, this is what the whole the Truth Commission is about, is moral injury. We got that. And so we sent it to everybody among the commissioners and the testifiers. And we said, read this because it will inform what we do at the Truth Commission. And so it did. And it was really powerful because we had that lens, that new framing of what we were doing. So the next day, when we had small group discussions and all day we had conversations about what we wanted to recommend as a Truth Commission. And so there was an open mic, everybody was sort of speaking after we gathered back together. And the head of the Mennonite Central Committee, whose name has fallen out of my brain, walked up to the microphone and he said, I think we pacifists have a lot to repent of, which was not what I thought he was going to say. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Why is he, we're talking about moral injury and he's saying we need to repent. And he said, and I say that because we let the US government define who a conscientious objector is. And we have veterans who are not pacifists, who went to prison rather than redeploy to a war they believed was an unjust war. One of our testifiers was like that. He said, we let the government decide who a conscientious objector is, and we took our special pacifist status and walked away from the just war people who agree with us on about 95% of the things we believe. And we just disagree on 5% maybe of whether a war could ever be just or not, or whether war can be justified. He said, but we abandoned them rather than fight for them too, to be conscientious objectors. And that was like, we're all in shock. And then of course he had a point. And so the commission and moral injury became part of that conversation around his need to repent of something he thought had been a huge mistake that pacifists had made around the way we handle war in the military. So that's when I realized that moral injury was a fascinating way that crossed the kind of ideological divides that people think are their truth. So he was able to see how someone who wasn't a pacifist, who actually volunteered to enter the military to defend their country, could decide not that they didn't qualify as for conscientious objector status because the government had decided a conscientious objector had to object to all wars. So that a person who was a just war proponent in the military was not allowed to take a moral stand on a particular war. And that was a violation of human conscience, that they could not do that. So that's how I got into the moral injury work, because it began to seem to me to be something that brought people together that normally argue. And so that I got more and more fascinated with it. And now with COVID, it's been all over the media, all these new experiences that people are having that they can't make moral sense of. So you have EMTs and medical doctors and first responders and all kinds of healthcare professionals struggling with being completely unprepared for the amount of death they had to deal with, and they had committed their lives as saving lives and they couldn't save anybody, and the moral injury and the impact of COVID, and then the death of George Floyd, which the whole planet's watched, a 9-minute murder on video. I think we're now seeing moral injury in so many places and in so many forms because people are having devastating experiences that challenge their core identity, the sense of who they are, the sense of who they are as a good professional, or as a good person.
Wow, Rita, thank you for bringing this forward.
Yeah, I'm thankful for the complexity of the work of moral repair. And I
Yeah.
see how it's spreading beyond the military as well. It's going into the medical field in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's this shift that we're seeing, and with George Floyd and all of these things, and kind of like you were saying when you were defining conflict, and a piece that I layered in, it moves us forward if we commit to that work.
Yeah.
How does it affect the collective work of a nation? In a sense, it's often on the individual. Is it possible to kind of translate or to transfer this to broader groups and systems as
Yeah.
well?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that one of the worst forms, or not worst, but they're all bad, but one of the most difficult aspects of moral injury to recover from, and is so deeply traumatizing to people, is when they've been betrayed by powerful people or people with power. And we're seeing that now with Afghanistan veterans coming home after they fought for their country, and now their country's like, well, it's over now, that we're going to just turn it back, the Taliban's going to take over, and abandoning the people that they promised safety to, the Afghanis who helped them, and then being forced to leave them behind. All of those sorts of things, because a power system decided, well, okay, this is what's going to happen now. And it's similar to the way Vietnam era veterans felt betrayed by their own government because they served honorably in a war that was not an honorable war. And so I think that kind of betrayal is one of the hardest things to deal with, because you've been harmed by somebody you needed to trust, and instead they didn't have your back. They let your friend die, or they abandoned the rightness of the cause because it turns out it wasn't a good cause. So I think that, and there was actually literature coming out even before COVID about how a lot of doctors were either killing themselves or giving up their professions in medicine because of managed care and the kind of healthcare system we have that prohibits them from providing the best standard of care because it's too expensive or the insurance company won't pay for it. And how demoralizing that is if you're a doctor and you want to give your best standard of care. And so that kind where you have to fight powers more powerful than you are because they're betraying you, can lead you to a kind of demoralized state or a kind of toxic fury about something that you can't do a whole lot about, and yet is causing great harm, and you want to try to stop that harm and you cannot. And that goes on for generations back, because we have so many oppressive systems from the past that people carry in the legacies of their own communities. So I think racism is one of those legacies. Sexism is another one of those legacies. There's so many of these legacies where the community is carrying generations of moral injury and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we see that in the work of Resmaa Menakem as well, is he's talking about how bodies transfer trauma to other bodies, and Europeans coming to this country as refugees, initially as vulnerable people escaping violence and oppression, but then transferring their pain and their harm onto other immigrant bodies and eventually Black and brown bodies, and it just piles on. So how to shift from the transference to the transformation.
Yeah. And that's the I think that the processing of moral injury is absolutely crucial to the transformation of that trauma into a force for good rather than a force for self-destruction or violent harm.
Mm.
So it's because you don't forget the past, you don't forget the worst experience of your life, you don't forget the legacies of the people you care about, the generations back, the pain that they carry. This is not, you don't forget those things, but if you respond to those things as if they happened to you, you've lost that what I would call capacity to have space between you and the trauma so you can actually examine the trauma and process it. You become so identified with it and carry it that it starts to drive your life rather than informing your life. And I think that's really, it's a subtle distinction, but that's a distinction between trauma harming you and trauma being carried in a creative way.
And making you resilient and actually transforming the context.
And being able to remember what happened as a source of wisdom for the choices you make later in your life, or for things that you now know about the world that will help you understand the world better, or yourself better. Instead, the pain of the trauma is what's driving you, not your knowledge of the trauma.
And also recognizing that you are here. They may not be here, but you are a product of them, and you're now here. Yeah. And you have wisdom that carries you, and you have this hope, and you apparently have this strength to survive. You're here now.
Yeah. There's a woman named Mariana Hirsch who studies the literature of Holocaust, the children of the Holocaust, not the Holocaust survivors, but their children, because she is one herself. She's a child of the Holocaust. And what she says is that the generation that didn't suffer so much can begin to feel like, even when the generation is above them or before them is relatively silent and not talking too much about the trauma, but you know it was terrible, that you begin to feel like your own life is sort of trivial by comparison. And so the children will sometimes take on their parents' stories as their own and live into them in a way that where their whole lives are sort of swallowed by the past. And they're not free, they're not able to live their lives beyond that trauma. They carry it as their own. And so she talks about some of the literature that demonstrates that, and how important it is for telling the stories of previous generations to have them processed so that you don't feel like it's your story, but it is part of your history. And it's really important to remember and tell it. And that it's a subtle distinction, but it's an important one, I think, for, as you say, for resilience.
So you are currently leading a social impact organization that has stepped up during the time of COVID, the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about what you and your organization are trying to address and how you've been helping people to cope with the emotional and moral trauma of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, we could, those of us work in moral injury could see this one coming. This was going to be really bad, especially for frontline caregivers. And so we started talking about, could we use some of the things we learned from a pilot we did with military veterans with moral injury that helped them recover their own sense of self-worth and resilience? Could we find elements of that program that we might be able to turn into something online, so it was safe, that would not take long, because people work in the front lines didn't have a lot of spare time. So we decided maybe an hour, maybe they could do an hour online. And we took a couple of the things that our facilitators for our veteran program thought might be the best processes to use in that hour, to give people an hour's chance in a small group of people, peer facilitated and confidential, to just unload some of the moral distress they're carrying so they're not carrying so much of it. And to do it in a group of people and feel validated and believed for how they're feeling, and respected for what they're trying to do. And so we created the veteran program we had was called Resilient Strength Time, RST. And so we changed the name of the program to Resilience. The veteran was Resilient Strength Training. So the veterans, veterans like to train, so we called it training. And we decided to call the one that would be 1 hour online in a group format, Resilient Strength Time, and we shortened the initials to REST, REST. And we called it REST, which seemed like an appropriate thing for people who are working to beyond exhaustion. And and we started with our own employees, because Volunteers of Barron has medical clinics and frontline caregivers and senior centers. We had plenty of frontline workers, and we brought in our veteran facilitators who knew how to run the program for veterans to help us start this hour-long program and train new facilitators for it and all of that. And we started it last summer, and we tried it with our employees, and then we slowly have been opening it out to the public and to other people. And so we now have the AARP running groups for mature adults who have been victims of fraud. And we're just about to launch a major program for a healthcare company for their graduate nurse class coming in, 200 of them in September, to get them in the habit of using the program to help them get through the stresses of their first year of nursing. And we're also applying for a grant to expand this in 3 cities to first responders, ER, frontline workers, and I think there's several categories beyond just medical doctors and nurses, but in any case, law enforcement is another one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Helping law enforcement reclaim their souls.
Yeah,
This is critical. They definitely. I'm going to talk to you later about that.
Yeah. So if we get those funds, we'll start that program in January. But we, the biggest hurdle has been, of course, getting people to try REST. And once they try REST, they tend to come back and use it multiple times. And it's not a complete processing program for moral injury. It's just a way to help people maintain their sense of worth and stay with what they feel they need to do without being destroyed by it.
I love it. REST. It's so invitational. If you get them to do it initially.
Yeah. Just take an hour's rest. And I facilitate a few groups myself because I train the facilitators. And I think I should try it a little bit every now and then. I've had people just devastated. Chaplains who spent months helping people die because that's the only thing, and then helping staff cope with the fact that they couldn't be there for their patients because there were too many patients that needed their help, and so they would run from one to the other, and the one they just helped would die, and the patient died alone, and even medical people feel bad about that. And so these chaplains were trying to help the staff and help patients who needed accompaniment, and families who were all upset because people were dying and the families couldn't help. And they come into the REST group and they're carrying all of that. They're carrying all of that freight. Yes. And just to be able to cry, to say, I feel terrible, and have other people say, yeah, it's really, really horrible.
Yeah. I remember this from our hospital here in the Bronx, St. Barnabas, where the chief of staff was on the news every night, and this is what he was saying. And you saw the staff weeping over the people that were lost, and they couldn't do anything about it, and it was overwhelming. And I was saying, what happened for them? What can we offer them? So thank you so much, Rita.
And it's still going on. You just go to VOA. It's www.voa.org/rest, and it will take you to the site, and you could register for an account and show up for a REST meeting. It's just actually free and open to the public right now. We're I don't know if we're going to charge for it or not, but we've been offering it for a year because the acute need was there, and right now the surge is happening, so we're certainly not going to charge right now.
voa.org/rest.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a two-part question. As a theologian,
Mhm.
is there a story in the scripture that you've used to frame the work of moral injury? And two, what do you wish that clergy knew or understood about moral injury?
Wow, I think the entire Bible is a document about moral
Full of
injury.
trauma,
You
full of
can-
violence.
Yeah, and in fact, Brad Kelly, who's a Nazarene professor in San Diego, has written a book, The Bible and Moral Injury, and then he's got a collection exploring moral injury. And so there's lots of stuff happening around the Bible right now on moral injury. But one of the stories I think that's really quite powerful about this is actually the story in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, when they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the ancient church understood this also as a kind of almost like a moral injury story, that they were naive about what they thought they needed to know. In the same way that people, swear an oath to protect the Constitution and enlist in the military because they think they're going to be heroes or they really want to serve them, and they have no idea what it means to go to war. Or someone who decides to have a child, you don't know when you take that on what it's really going to mean to be a parent. It's huge. And so when they ate of the knowledge of the tree, the good and evil, they suddenly had a sense of that they had taken on way too much, and so they were kind of scared, and so God confronts them, and Adam says, "Well, it's not my fault. She did it," and she said, "The one my fault. The snake did it." And I think that this is the interpretation that Jim Forbes presented at one point that I think is a really wise way to understand the story. Is the reason they had to leave the garden wasn't because they had, eaten of that fruit, but it was that when they were challenged, they couldn't take moral responsibility. And you cannot live well and peacefully and flourish if you cannot take responsibility for your moral failures.
That's so powerful.
That is so powerful. Yes, that is so deep. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just one story, though. I mean, Brad Kelly thinks the story of Saul is the story of a warrior with moral injury who couldn't get, his personality was so drastically changed by the things he had to do that he was a mess. And then there's a wonderful interpretation of the story of the Gerasene demoniac, the person who's been chained in the graveyard because he's cutting himself with stones, and the community has no idea what to do with him. And a military veteran, Michael Yandel, who's got his PhD in theology now on moral injury from Emory, he wrote on that story. He said, well, when Jesus asks him who he is, he says, "My name is Legion." He says, and everybody tries to figure out what he's saying when he's saying that. It was, well, maybe he was a legionnaire. Maybe he was in the Roman military. Maybe he's a veteran who can't come to terms with what he had to do in the Roman army. And so he's self-destructive like veterans are. And so Jesus is his salvation. Jesus is like going to forgive him and all of that. And then he wants to go. And Jesus says, no, you can't come with me. Because he's still got work to do at home. But now he's been freed from the demons and he can do that work.
Yeah.
That's another, it's a great story for that. Anyway, there are tons of them. And I actually think that some of the Psalms were written by people with moral injury.
I'm thinking of Peter, who was saying, Jesus, I'll never leave you.
Yeah.
And then he's so morally compromised in that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Judas, who killed himself.
And I'm thinking of my police officers last night who came to me like I was a criminal when I had called them for assistance. And then I had to basically confront them with their behavior. And in the end, I heard her say, "You are right." Wow. And I feel so much better because I was talking to them as though I would be talking to myself. I was saying, you have a job like this and you don't really care about our community. You're my partners. And the worst thing is I can't even pull the race card because you're one of me. And they just shut up and they were quiet. And then I said, and you don't recognize that we're partners. You're my partner in this community. And she said, you're absolutely right. Wow. And I felt totally better. I felt like, thank you.
Well, because instead of polarizing the situation further by making them evil, you actually appealed to their humanity.
You're my partner. And you're my own people, and you're coming out here like I'm a criminal. I was like, and I can't even pull the race card because you're one of me. They just became, yeah.
Well, and that, I think that's when the change in a polarized situation happens, is if you can find your way to the humanity of the other person, even if they don't see it in themselves.
Because we care about them. I care about them. I know it's tough for them out here. I care about them.
Yeah. And we want we want police officers who actually do a good job.
We want them to be human.
Yeah.
The second question, what do you wish clergy knew or understood about moral injury?
I think there are two things. One is you may have it yourself. If you had more than 2 or 3 of the ACE factors, the adverse childhood experience factors that traumatize children, you may be carrying moral injury yourself. And you need to take care of it because you won't be able to survive the profession if you don't take care of it. So don't ignore your trauma. Don't ignore feelings of unease, anger, demoralization that you may feel. The second is that most bad human behavior, antisocial, anti-community values, is generally grounded in some kind of traumatic and often morally injurious experience that has been unprocessed. So if you can figure out strategies for the people you serve to give them a chance to talk about their moral injury without judgment. This is the thing with moral injury. If you create a context where people don't trust you because they feel like they're going to be judged, they'll never talk about it. And there are lots of ways to help people talk about it, lots of strategies. But if you don't attend to that in your congregation or in the people that you serve, they will just remain in a state of being morally injured without being able to resolve those things. And we actually, it's interesting, we started a course at the end of June and offered 4 sessions of the course on moral injury in the aftermath of COVID. And it was designed for clergy, chaplains, and spiritual care providers. And we used our own Volunteers of America ministers and trained them to become facilitators of moral injury strategy processing strategies. And so the first 3 hours of the course was co-facilitation by these trained ministers to help the people taking the course experience 3 hours of what it meant to process moral injury. And we didn't assume they had it, but we assumed that experiencing the process itself would be useful to them as a learning process. And so, of course, a whole lot of amazing things got shared in those small groups. It's 10 people each with 2 facilitators. So when we came into the part where I actually talked about moral injury, they had a whole different sense of what that was, having just gone through those 3 hours of processing with their peers. And so if people can learn to do that, it will make their community so much better.
Thank you, Rita. This is such food for the soul. Rita, in the midst of so many crises affecting our country and our world right now, the pandemic, economic challenges, racial injustice, climate change, and on and on. And yet you are a person of profound faith. Where do you see hope in these times?
I actually see it in the work on moral injury, because people who actually care and want their lives to mean something to other people are much more susceptible to moral injury. Because when they fail other people, they start to feel terrible. And they may fail because, for example, one of our veterans had a really horrible childhood. He had a father who tortured his children, and he really just was miserable. And he came through our, and he's a Vietnam era veteran, and he had been homeless. So he really was struggling. And he came into our moral injury processing program because he was living in VOA housing for veterans. And he was able to, in the week that he was with us in this retreat center, come to terms with the things his father had done and the things he'd experienced in the military, to the point that when he left, he wanted to connect with a nephew he had cared about but hadn't seen in years. And he decided that he would use his spare time to go to senior centers and talk to people in senior centers who don't get any visitors. And he would just spend, time talking to them, so they had someone to talk to, and playing chess in the park with the old men and talking to them. He just sort of became like a sort of pastoral counselor, I think, to people, because he wanted to do something positive with his life, because he finally realized he was a good person and he deserved to be happy. And that he was worthwhile. And when he's told this story publicly, and then he said, before RST, our veterans program, before RST, he said, I lived my life in black and white, and now I live it in Technicolor.
Wow, the community
interesting
model.
And that's what gives me hope, is that you can take people who have been in prison for doing, attempted murder, been in prison for drug charges, spent time in prison and come out and then chronically homeless. And if you give them a chance to share why they're so miserable, what they're carrying, with other people who will care about them and believe them and not worry about adjudicating truth or judging or having an opinion about their story, just hearing the feelings under the story and saying, I believe you and I care about you, that it can work miracles.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to fix climate change. There are terrible fires. The war in Afghanistan is ending. The world is a mess. But there are younger people. I don't know that my generation is going to fix anything now, but I do have hope in younger generations. I just see that the activism around climate change and other things coming out of younger generations in ways that I have hope in them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that bad things won't keep happening. They just will. But I have hope in them that if anyone can stall out some of the bad things and maybe turn something around, that they can do that.
Yeah.
You can create a new future. I believe that.
Yeah. And it won't be what we envision or what they envision, but if they keep at it, it will be better.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have to say, I have to also remind myself of things like, I would never have predicted that gay marriage would have been legal in my lifetime.
So many changes.
There are things that have changed so fast.
Right. Amazing.
That I had no hope of, 20 years ago, thinking, I don't know. This seems like so hard.
Right.
So, of course, I also never imagined the last president we had either. So I also, my imaginations about evil are kind of limited as well, or a tragedy anyway. So I can't say that what I can predict for the future is ever very accurate. But I do have really, the cousins of the children of my cousins and siblings and people that I know. They're great. They're just great kids.
Yes. These
yeah.
young people coming up, so much empathy and insight and orientation towards action.
Yeah.
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 The last question from me, it's again 2 parts.
Great.
The work of peace building and healing often takes generations. How do you maintain that deep vision? And where do you find joy to sustain your work and your witness?
So I sustain that deep vision because, as I said, I can't predict the future, but I feel that this work on moral injury has helped me see a key to really opening up the humanity in people and connecting them to each other in ways that I couldn't see before. I find joy in just taking my cat. I have a cat that will walk on a leash, and we do an hour walk in the morning and an hour walk in the evening, and watching her chase bugs and squirrels on a leash, just observing her life in the world of nature is a joy to me. It's a little like one-pointed meditation of paying attention to her so she doesn't get into trouble. So I can't be distracted and not paying attention to her. So I find joy in that, and I find joy in the natural world where I find beauty. I love art and beauty, and of course, friends.
Yes, friends.
Friends. Yeah, I'm not. I don't have children. I live by myself. And the thing that sustained me all my life are my friends.
Yes.
They matter.
Thank you so much. It's such a gift to bear witness to your work and all that you're leading, the change in your spheres of influence. Thank you for this time sharing with us. I
just want to say one of the great gifts of the last part of my life, this will be the last work I ever do, then I'll retire, is having been able to move over to Volunteers of America from the world of academia to the world of social service work. Because teaching about something is a very different thing than actually trying to make a program that will help people. And
you've taken an interesting step, because you've gone from the academy to being a practitioner in an organization.
Yeah, and I've had amazing support from all sectors at Volunteers of America, people pitching in to help me figure things out and have skill sets that I never would have, and so it's been really gratifying to be able to try things that I think might help, and then seeing some of the most amazing people come out of the programs.
Yeah, Volunteers of America is very interesting too. I know a bit about it through my work at the Bowery Mission that serves the homeless community in New York.
Yeah.
And it was one of the earliest leaders was actually, he'd worked for Volunteers of America and with the Booth family, which is also the Salvation Army. So there's all these deep connections and the social gospel movement that was happening when these organizations were birthed.
Yep. And Volunteers America is 125 years old this year.
It's great.
And they're on the ground everywhere. We have
huge.
And unlike the Salvation Army, they didn't keep the uniforms and the sort of militarized culture. And I think the 19th century social gospel theology is also sort of moving in more modern directions. But there is still that ethos of that evangelical social gospel within Volunteers of America, the least of these and the most vulnerable, and some of that. And it's not the way I would talk about the social justice work I do, but I appreciate that heart, that commitment to doing good work in the world.
And they make space for so many people who are on the margins. This is one of the things I love about them, making space for the purpose to come forward.
Yeah. So we have had veterans come into our program literally, out of prison for two months, people who have been chronically homeless, We had a low-income housing program for veterans with children that came into our program. Which and they're all amazing people. They just need a chance.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this just nourishment. I just appreciate it so much. I'm looking forward to the more. We've had a meaningful conversation with you today, Rita, and inspirational, and as I said, nourishing. We like to finish on a personal note.
Okay.
We like to know a little bit more about you. So we're going to close out with a lightning round. It's an either or so that we can learn a little bit more about you. So on time, running late, or early?
Late. On the Myers-Briggs, I have no J scores. I'm totally P.
It's great. You're the first and only person.
Confident. Oh, thank you for that, Rita.
You're the only person who said late in the whole season.
I
Thank you
know
for your
somebody
honesty.
did say running late. Jason, someone did say running late.
Okay.
Yeah, running late, not late, running late. Tea or coffee?
Well, I would have said coffee for most of my life, but I switched to tea a week ago. So tea.
Drama or comedy?
Drama.
Ocean or mountains?
Mountains.
Big party or small gathering?
Small gathering.
Sweet or salty?
Salty.
Singing or dancing?
Dancing.
Rita, thank you for this meaningful conversation and for our time together. And thank you to all who turned in for this conversation and who've journeyed with us this season. Whether you're listening on a podcast or on YouTube, remember to like, subscribe, and share.
And until we see you again, walk in peace. And again, we want to thank you for joining us in teaching peace. Carry it forward.